basic disturbances of sensation and perception. And this time we'll continue the topic about the disturbances of psyche. All are special psyche we didn't talk about before, as well as talking about psychopathological syndromes. Okay, this will be a lengthy topic. I hope I will be able to do both syndromes and basic disturbances in one go, because usually I tear apart this topic into two, but we'll see, because unfortunately we have curfew as well here, so I shouldn't be too free with my time and with writing here. Okay, so just so that you remember, the mental process can be divided into cognitive functions, which are sensation, perception, memory, thinking, and attention. Also emotional and volitional, affective volitional sphere, so our emotions and how we move and what we move for, our drives. Also consciousness, and all the disturbances, once again, I remind you, can be divided into qualitative and quantitative disturbances. So, for example, there may be too much of a certain function, too little of a certain function, no function at all, or a certain distortion of it. And we'll apply this principle to any symptom we'll be talking about today. Let's start with the memory. So, just so you know, memory is a mental process of imprinting and preservation of human experience. And there are main four processes of memory. So it is memorizing, when you try to fixate the new experience you have gotten. It's storing the memory. Then it is when you need a person, and there is also forgetting. And shouldn't forget about forgetting. Pun unintended. Our information, which we try to remember, doesn't get destroyed in the process of forgetting. It is actually suppressed in our unconsciousness and can be retrieved via certain techniques, for example, by putting the person in the trance through hypnotizing, or certain techniques of remembering the traumatic experiences. And it is always evident in our behavior. We may be not conscious about certain emotions, about certain reactions, but they will influence our behavior. For example, the person who has PTSD and has experienced something very traumatic may not remember the event itself. But, for example, this person will be very tense in front of male people, for example, because this person has passed through traumatic experiences where the man was the culprit, for example. So we can see the result of these experiences and the trace of these emotions in the person. But this trace is invisible to the consciousness of the person itself, themselves. Okay, so what can happen with our memory? So the same principle. There may be too much of memory, so hyperamnesia, and this is the disturbance, once again, in relation to the norm. So having very good memory, where you can remember any tiny bit about any event from your life, from any day, is not an often phenomenon. So it is not a frequent phenomenon. It is very rare. That's why we say that it is a deviation from the norm. But it is not always bad. Well, if you saw my first topic, I was talking about the differentiation between good, bad, non-pathological, healthy, unhealthy, and stuff. So here we are talking about the deviation from the norm. Happen in traumatic experiences, because just as well as forgetting different things about the traumatic experience, the person may be hypermnestic about the details. For example, they may remember all the tiny bits of the cars they have seen throughout the, for example, car accident. If they didn't hit their head, of course. So such things. Also, something which was very emotional for the person. You may remember each stimuli from that event much more acutely than it was in the real life. So once again, this is another example of this. Also, what I need you to know is that emotional memory is usually more durable than verbal logistic memory. What I mean by this, people with dementia, for example, who are losing their memory, when they see you for the first time, they react at you as if they don't know you, because you are just getting met up for the first time. On the next day, when consciously they won't remember you as well, they will ask your name once again. Emotionally, they will react to you as if they know you, because they already saw you yesterday, but they don't remember verbally. But emotionally, the reaction is the same. And this is very important, because once again, it is an evidence of how strong our memory actually is and how strong the influence of our emotions is. And when I will be talking about the sphere of emotions, I will talk about relationships. Because when we try to see these symptoms apart from one another, divided into spheres, it is an artificial division. In real life, our psyche cannot be divided like this. And each link of it influences another. And this is something which I was talking about while I was discussing integrity of the psyche and of the behavior on the previous lesson. Okay, so yes, there may be hypermnesia, but what is has much more value in the pathological sense is, of course, the loss of the memory, amnesia, or a diminishment of it, hypermnesia. So what is all about this? For example, amnesia and hypermnesia may be of fixation type. So what is fixation amnesia? The person doesn't retain new experiences. I have had this patient in the ward for chronically ill man who was formerly a boxer, and he was admitted to the hospital because he was losing his memory and his intellectual skills. So he had dementia induced by this traumatic influence of his sport, because he was hit in the head too many times. I was talking to him, and he would literally forget what was going on his desk 2 minutes after. So you can put some of your own objects on this desk, and later on, after 2 minutes or so, ask the patient about this object, whose this thing is. And the patient wouldn't recognize that it is not theirs. So that's first thing. Another thing is that I have asked him if he had any children, and he told me that he has a daughter. When I asked about the age of the daughter, he stated that she was 7 years old. But when I checked his papers, his analysis, his daughter was actually 27 years old. So you can imagine at which point he froze in time due to his memory, because he wasn't remembering new experiences. It is actually very hard for the people around the patient than the patient themselves, because from the certain point, people with dementia lose their critics to the situation. They no longer understand that they lack something in their psyche. But people around feel as if they are losing the connection with this person, because they are losing this emotional experience with them. Also, what I needed to tell, emotional experiences, this thing. Yeah, also about his mood. Because he was not gaining new experiences, he wasn't losing anything in his life subjectively, and therefore his mood was always elevated. He was always very euphoric. He was thankful to other people. He was very smiley all the time. He was putting thumbs up all the time without any reason for it, because he didn't know any sadness from not losing anything in his life. But of course, for the outside people, it was very sad. Also, amnesia can be reproductive when the person isn't able to get the information from their memory, even though they remember it themselves, but when they try to pass this information, they cannot remember anything. There is also retrograde amnesia. So the person loses the memories preceding the illness, starting from the most recent one and finishing with the most old ones. When we are talking about anterograde amnesia, the person loses the memory on the period of being ill. For example, if the person is suffering from delirium, they may remember very vividly what was happening within their hallucinations, but they will have problems remembering what was happening in the real world. Okay, what else? There may be a combination. For example, antero-retrograde. People who have lost consciousness because they have hit their head while falling from the stairs, for example. They may not remember the period before the trauma and the period during the trauma, because they were unconscious. Memory loss can be progressive and non-progressive. Non-progressive memory loss is more typical for acute traumas, that the person hit their head and they forget a certain period of time, but it doesn't progress. The progressive amnesia is more typical for organic disorders such as dementia, vascular dementia, and like neurosyphilis and stuff, because there is a certain pathogenicity to this illness. There is a dynamic in this illness. So when you see that the person starts losing more and more and more of this memory, this already is a sign for you of a certain registry of illnesses. So you should be very attentive to this. And there is also affectogenic amnesia. Affectogenic amnesia happens when the person relates in a certain way to the event, and this relationship, this attitude is so painful, so intense in its strength, that the person would rather forget about this event than try to experience these emotions, because this bears the danger to our psyche. Once again, this is a defensive mechanism, forgetting. So affectogenic amnesia is very common, for example, for people with hysteria, who may forget any event which is not, I would say, which is not beneficial to them, which is deemed not beneficial. And this is, once again, unconscious defense mechanism. So they are not doing this on purpose. But when they claim that they haven't done something they did the other day, they fully believe in this. And once again, how to differentiate from the person who is simulating. The simulating person usually has a pause between their line. The simulating person usually thinks about what to say, and emotionally they will feel stressed when interrogated about the event. For example, the person with the affectogenic amnesia, with the histrionic demonstrative amnesia, they will fully believe that the event didn't exist, and they won't even show emotionally that something was related to that. So you see that they fully believe that their life is like they imagine it to be. So that's the difference. But of course, you'll be able to differentiate only if you have enough experience, because I have had plentiful of patients with demonstrative traits who, once again, not because of the ill will or because they are bad or something, but because they have these traits in their character, they were making up a lot of things. And sometimes it was very hard for me to differentiate between truth and the lies. Okay. Now about the distortions of the memory. So sometimes there may be distortions, and there are three main types of distortions of memory: paramnesias, distortion of memory. So pseudoreminiscences, confabulations, and cryptomnesia. Some of these types are much easier to understand, some are harder. I will try to break them down so that you will understand. So pseudoreminiscence is the phenomenon when the person attributes some existing event from their biography to the wrong date. For example, that very boxer was claiming to me that he had been running on the stadium yesterday when I was talking to him. But the thing was that he has spent 3 years up to the day in the hospital. He wasn't living. He wasn't at the stadium. But when he was a sportsman, he was a boxer, of course he was training in the stadium. So he just took a real event and repeated another day. That's pseudoreminiscence. When we're talking about confabulations, usually confabulations are very fairy-like, fairy tale-like. They are very fantastic in their core, and you already may be very suspicious about information you're given. For example, the person may claim that they remember being on the moon the other day. They may describe the surface of the moon in great detail. But this is not a hallucination. They're not seeing themselves on the moon. This is a conviction that you have a memory of actually having a certain experience. So confabulations can happen to the healthy individuals, so also upon being induced, if they are suggestive enough. For example, I have seen some patients who, because they talk a lot to the victims of sexual abuse, have come to believe that they also have suffered from similar trauma in their childhood. But this actually never happened. But they were induced to think like this. Not to mention that I need you to understand that our memory isn't firm. It is fluid. It is constantly reconstructing itself to fit our current identity. So when the person, for example, says that I always have been like this, you should take this information with a doubt. Because sometimes if there is a very strong conviction right now, in order to fit all the previous experience to this conviction, the person will deny everything that happened with them, may even forget about it, and just say that I was always like this. I was always very diligent. I was always smart. For example, I always ate pasta for the supper. Well, these examples are not very firm, but I also have noticed this in the LGBTQ community. Not everyone, but some people indeed claim that they always had a certain preference in their sexual life, despite having objective facts contradicting those. Because these facts usually, in this case, usually they remind them of some traumatic experience. So it is best to deny than to re-experience the pain once again. This is not bad, this is not good, this is just how our psyche works. And you should take this into account if this matters when you're trying to treat your patient, yes? Okay, so those are confabulations. Confabulations are fantastic events which never took place, but the person is convinced they have. There are also cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia is also a memory of an event that never took place in the life of the person, but the difference from confabulation is that this event is usually a realistic one, and there is a trait of attribution of this event. So what I'm meaning by this? For example, the person has read in the newspaper that their neighbor has won the lottery. And so the person says, oh, that's me, that's my jackpot, I have won the lottery. So they take the good memory from another person and they attribute it to themselves because they want to be like this. They want to be a part of something good. It can work in the opposite way. For example, I know that my wife is actually cheating on me, but I claim that I have seen the wife of my neighbor cheating on him. It's not my wife. It's the problem of their pair, not mine. My partner is ideal. It's their problem. So I'm taking this memory I don't like about my biography and I attribute it to another person. So that's cryptomnesia. In this way, a lot of people may start plagiarizing works, but how to differentiate from the person intentionally taking the fame of some famous artists, for example, and how to differentiate it from the cryptomnesia case. In case of cryptomnesia, the secondary benefit isn't obvious, and usually you wouldn't find it right away. So, for example, if I would plagiarize others, I would probably say that I have drawn Mona Lisa. I have painted Mona Lisa, or for example, that I have written Harry Potter, because those things will get money to me. So I have the goal to be intentional about it. But the person with cryptomnesia would be like, well, I'm the author of the article of this local newspaper in some forgotten village, so they do not get revenue for this. So here is that. Also, there may be a disturbance of the sensation of familiarity, for example, and you probably have all experienced it. So, déjà vu, when something you have never experienced feels like as if you have experienced it before. There is an opposite phenomenon called jamais vu or jamais vu. Unfortunately, I'm not French, so I may be mistaken in the pronunciation. So, something you have known for all your life appears foreign for you and unfamiliar. And also there may be a symptom of one own's negative and positive double. For example, I claim that it's not me who killed my neighbor, it is my evil clone. Or for example, there are like good people walking around who look like me, such things. Okay. So how do we study the memory? Of course, the most basic and easy way to study the memory is to actually talk to the person. So when we were talking about sensations, we could use different instruments from neurologicals. When we are talking about hallucinations and perception, we would talk to the person to observe their behavior. Here with the memory, we can also talk. So do you remember my name? Do you remember your age? Where are you right now? Who you are? What were you doing yesterday? What were you doing tomorrow? What will you do tomorrow? What were you eating for the breakfast? Such questions, very easy questions. Okay, what else? Okay, so such questions. But when questions are not enough, we can use objective psychodiagnostical methods. For example, memorizing numbers. I'm not sure if you will see here, but there is such test called Lexus test. It is a test for IQ, and one of its scales is designed to fit the memory test. So there are rows of numbers, which are named in the correct order and in the opposite order. And the longer the row of the numbers the person will be able to remember, the better the memory. And we attribute points according to these rows. There is also 10 words test. So you name 10 words to the person, and the person should repeat these words. And there is also story reproduction once again. So you see how the person distorts the story you are telling them. Okay, so all these tests I'm talking about, you'll probably find them in the presentation. So I'm not showing you any pictures, I'm just commenting on it. And it would be ideal if you would watch my video and also look at the presentation if you are able to do this. Okay, now, disturbances of attention. So attention is also a very important thing, and mainly it is the meaningful concentration on a certain object or activity. It helps us to reach our goals and to construct and organize our life. And of course, there are different disturbances of attention in different illnesses. So we'll try to talk about those. Attention, for example, may be very distracted. So the person tries to pay the attention to some one object, but something else happens and they automatically turn away and start doing something else. So that's disturbability of attention, inability to concentrate on one kind of any work. Then attention may be riveting, when the person becomes stuck on a certain object. Sometimes it is also called hyperfocus, especially in the communities of people with ADHD. So the person becomes stuck and they cannot switch to anything else. You may think that, well, being able to concentrate is actually very good. I'm always distracted by things when I try to do my homework. Why is this a bad thing? Once again, I remind you that yes, without proper experience with people with illnesses, you won't see the difference between illness symptoms, so ill signs, and just different deviations from the norm. When we are talking about pathological repeating of attention, the person, and I have mentioned this sign before, and I'll repeat it again, starts neglecting their basic needs. And for example, their attention may be so stuck, they will not be able to save themselves from the danger. What I mean by this? There was this case of ADHD in one boy from America, who was constantly distracted. So ADHD is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So attention deficit is one of the main symptoms here, if you are talking about a certain type of disease. And this guy, he couldn't concentrate on anything. His life was in chaos, but he knew that the only activity which would give him enough discipline to be concentrated was sports. And so one day he came to the basement in order to do some sports. He got hyper-focused on this activity, and he was retrieved from the basement 3 days after by his parents, being malnourished and almost dying, because he wasn't drinking, he wasn't eating, he wasn't having a rest, he wasn't sleeping, he wasn't going to the toilet. He was only doing the sports until he fell down exhausted. He was rushed to the reanimation, and luckily he was saved, but you can imagine how dangerous it was. So the same thing is with the distractibility of attention. For example, there was another case of a child with ADHD at the age of 4 who climbed up the tower and didn't know how to get back because she got distracted while she was doing it, and just automatically she was here and now she is on the tower, and like it is a 4-year-old child. It is dangerous. So this thing. So when I have met a lot of people who found the signs of the change in their level of attention, or like they did not have enough discipline or the will in order to sustain a certain level of attention, and they were immediately thinking, oh no, I have ADHD. No, that's not the level of the disturbance you are talking about when we are trying to talk about ADHD. Of course, there are different levels of severity, and I'll be talking about this when we'll be talking about the ADHD in general. It's probably 7th or 8th or 9th topic, I don't remember exactly. But you need to understand that when we are talking about illnesses cause pain, illnesses cause suffering to a certain level. And it should be comparable to the level of life and the quality of life you want to lead. In other forms, it is not the same. Once again, when you're feeling sad for 5 minutes, it is not the same as being grieving while you are depressed. It is not the same. The intensity is completely different. So don't compare, please. Without the help of the specialist, it is best not to diagnose yourself, because you'll find that you have a tumor of the brain, a broken leg coming out of your stomach or something like this, and that won't be any good. You just freak out and waste your time and the nerves of yourself and your family. Okay, more on the attention. So exhaustibility of attention. You may start very good, so you have you sit down, you are looking at your homework, you start doing it, but you start dozing off, you start to become distracted, you cannot keep your attention up. This is exhaustibility of attention. This can happen with a variety of reasons. The easiest reason is that you are just very tired, so that's why you cannot sustain the needed level of your work. Oh, the siren is working once again. Okay, so how do we study attention? One of my patients who was simulating ADHD, very poorly simulating, he claimed to me that you cannot measure the attention. It is very sad that he was also studying psychology, and he should have known better than me that attention can be studied with objective measures. Some of these tests are called, for example, Shelter's table. So you see in the presentation, it is a table with numbers, and you should find all the numbers in the correct succession, and the examiner tests the time you need for this. So that's Shelter's table. There is also Kraepelin test, or distracting numbers for Kraepelin. So it is the subsequent distracting of numbers. For example, 3 minus 2 minus 3 plus 9 minus 1. It tests operational memory and attention. There is also proofs test, also called infamous test, and I have mentioned it previously, but I'll remind you once again. It is a wall of symbols, and you should find and cross a certain symbol out of it. That's a proof test. When we're talking about an infamous test, it usually has an advanced instruction. For example, cross all A's which come after B's before C's. Such thing. Very easy. Also, yeah, in the presentation there will be a picture with multicolored dots, and this is not a test for daltonism. It is a test of switching of the attention. So you need to count all the dots of a certain color without pointing at them. So once again, this test was also used by me on that simulating guy, and he showed the average level of mistakes which are common to any person. Okay, now about thinking. Thinking is a higher form of our reflection of the outside world, and first and foremost our thoughts and our conscious reflection, because a lot of things we may reflect unintentionally and unconsciously in our reactions, in our body movements and the change of our breathing, etc. But here I'm talking about conscious acts, thinking acts. One may say that we cannot judge thinking directly, and that's true. Unfortunately, the thoughts are not intangible, but we can judge how the person thinks and how they link the ideas and how they form the ideas into words and into statements via judging their speech and the rate of their speech as well, because the rate of speech usually reflects their speed of the linking of the ideas the person has. So there is a variety of disturbances in the formation of concepts and in the formation of thinking, and I will be talking about all of those. So what can be wrong with the concepts? For example, the person may make pseudo-concepts, for example, using an insignificant sign of an object to represent the whole object. For example, I must say, pass me the green one. Which green one? Well, I see that I have like a green cup there, but you don't see it. You don't understand what the green one means. And I will become very angry if you don't understand me, because I understand what I mean. So when we are talking about the disturbance of thinking, it is also very important to understand that since we already all think differently, the person with the disturbance of this process may have troubles to connecting with others and to getting their ideas across. Because on the level of emotions, we understand what we mean. On the level of our symbolism and our words, we understand what we mean, but other people do not get this innate understanding. They need to be explained. So that's the problem for such patients. Also, what can happen? Agglutination or condensation of concepts. So in this case, we take two words which are generally used by the public, and they are smashed together. When I was 15 years old and I had a very bad period, and my wife probably, I will talk about it on the topic of the first episode of psychosis. So I would smash the whole sentences into one big word. Of course, my teachers weren't very fond of it, but it was what happened. It differs from the neologisms. When we are talking about neologisms, the person takes the parts of non-existent words and can smash them together. So, for example, the person may say polterania. What is polterania? Nobody knows, but the person knows, the patient, because there is a certain emotion attached to it, a certain meaning only known by this patient. So that is neologism. People with schizophrenia love making neologisms, especially neologisms with scientific hint. And at first you may start reading the articles, for example, you may think, okay, this person is probably like anatomics physician, or maybe an engineer, or maybe a historical person. But then they start talking about magic and stuff, and they start smashing together things which do not go logically together. And you understand that, no, this person probably has some problems. So here is that. For example, there is a very popular fabula of the delusion, called psyops. So psyops are psychic operators which influence people via different ways, making them to feel symptoms. So once again, usually the symptoms of schizophrenia, obviously. This fabula is very popular in the countries of former USSR and in America, but in America they have some other name to it. You may find whole books composed by the people who believe in psyops, dedicated to the forms of defense from these influences, to the way this develops. And I also found an article, a very valuable article by one person who has noted her psychosis from start to finish, how it was formed. And you, while reading it, you see how her distortions of thinking have progressed, and you'll see the initial problem with her, that she always attributed herself, and this was the start of her illness. So unfortunately, yes, these patients tend to form groups based upon this hatred towards psyops. And God forbid you to become one of the psyops in their eyes, because they may become even violent because you are tormenting them, obviously. So here is that. Okay, what can also be happening? The rate of the thinking may be disturbed. So the thought may be so fast, the person doesn't have time to spit it out, so galloping ideas. This is a typical symptom for maniacal states, for example, and sometimes for schizophrenia. But there is a difference. In schizophrenia, this symptom is called mantism, and the person stops talking to you and cannot get their thoughts across to you because they have too many thoughts at the same time. When we are talking about that is mantism, many thoughts at the same time. When we are talking about galloping ideas, when a lot of thoughts come in succession, in a fast succession, the person is usually manic, and they stop talking not because they have too many thoughts at the same time, but because they are unable to keep up with the speed of thoughts they are getting in their head. So these thoughts are hypersonic; they just cannot spit them out in time. So that is the difference. There may be an opposite thing, retarded thinking, in depression, for example. The person feels that their thoughts are forming so slowly that sometimes they get the feeling that they have become dumber, like physically. They may even complain of this, so that I feel that I'm dumb because I cannot solve the easiest tasks in time because it just takes for me a lot of time. When I had problems with thinking at the age of 15, for example, I was sitting at the test for mathematics for 7 hours, not because I didn't know the material, but because I couldn't get my thoughts around to understand and to form like the answer. And the teacher once again wasn't pleased. So that is retarded thinking. Can happen in depression and in variety of other disorders, but mainly in depression. It is connected to the attention as well. There is also such symptom as delay or arrest or Sperrung. So the Sperrung is when the person thinks about something and suddenly all the thoughts disappear. If you haven't experienced this symptom, this may be very alien to you, and you may not understand how this feels, but it is actually a very distinct feeling of being on the track of your thoughts, and suddenly they disappear, and you cannot get back, you cannot remember where you left off. If the person with the mentism, for example, can continue from the certain point, the person with the delay or arrest cannot. The person may just stop talking to you and then explain that I have stopped talking because I have no thoughts at the moment. That is arrest of thinking or Sperrung. Also very typical for schizophrenic form disorders and schizophrenia. Okay, now, what can be wrong with the form of thinking? So when we are talking about the form, it is the way how we link ideas when we try to get them across. And which, ideas. So what can be wrong? For example, pathologically circumstantial thinking. So what is this? You ask me, what was your breakfast? And I start telling you that I was eating walnuts which were placed on a white plate which was placed on the brown table, and this table had some scratches from the previous owners because it was very old, and I have bought it with a discount, and I was very annoyed by the color of this table. Maybe I need to try to paint it with another color, and so I was eating these walnuts, and I also had a cup of tea which was very cold for me, and I tried to bring the temperature up. The light from the microwave was too bright for me, etc., etc. So I'm answering your question, but I'm giving you too many details which are irrelevant to the main topic. That is pathological circumstantial thinking. Something like maybe philosophizing, or which is another name, toxic philosophizing. So what about this? I had a friend who had schizotypal personality disorder, and he was at certain point slipping into schizophrenic form psychosis a little bit. He was stopped midway, thankfully, by the therapy, but he was almost there. And so he was very religious, and he was always talking about some higher matters, about God, about sins, about the matter of life, about the universe. He had no job. He had no, I would say, like no goal in his life, but he was rambling on and on and on and on about the religion. So when we're talking about the toxic philosophizing, it is toxic because the ideas the person is thinking about constantly have no relation to their proper life, have no good influence in their life. So that is toxic philosophizing. There is also such thing as schizophasia, grammatically correct sentences, but all the words there are jumbled up because once again, when we try to say something, we first get the emotion and like our own understanding of what we want to say, and only then we translate this unconscious feeling into something conscious, and we translate it into words to get across idea to another person. And in the person with schizophrenia, this translation goes wrong. So the person understands what they want to tell, but the words used for that have no meaning for other people around. Incoherent thinking looks a lot like schizophrenia, but also the grammatical structure of the sentence is also off. So it is just random words altogether without any connection. There is also amorphous thinking. Amorphous thinking is different from coherent thinking because it happens mostly in people who are in agony, who are in amentive states. And when I will be talking about disorders of consciousness, I will talk about amentia. So the person with amorphous thinking can mutter like some fragments of their thoughts and elements which have no communicative goal in them and no function of communicating. So here is that. There is also paralogical thinking. Well, paralogical in the means that the normal logic is distorted. For example, I will say that like the person didn't come to meet me, and this means that they hate me. So that's paralogical thinking. I'm not judging the objective reasons for the sequence of events, but I'm judging from my emotions, and this is what you need to understand. Paralogic is always affective. It is governed by our mood and our emotions and sudden associations we get. So here is that. There is also autistic thinking. Autistic thinking is much more interesting for me. So what autism means? Autism means that the person is more directed towards their inner world and their communication with the outside world is diminished. The person who is autistic has a copy or internalized image of all the objects of the outside world and the world itself in their head. And they may have a certain set of rules, how this world operates, for example. And they judge everything coming from these rules. But other people may not understand this. And for example, an autistic person may get angry at you for some reason, because for them, your action meant something very personal and very important. But you may not understand why this matters, for example. That's also why, for example, people with autism, they have a preference for fixed patterns of behavior and routine. And for them, it is important. It is important that their cup stands on the cupboard in a specific place, and it shouldn't be moved from there. It is very important, because in their world, it is a set of rules. It is a rule. The cup stands on the cupboard like this. Autistic person usually has, the person with autistic thinking usually has problems empathizing another person, because once again, you need to get rid of your own rules and structures and to feel how it is to be another person or to empathize them. So that's a problem when you are only using your autistic thinking. Also, in autistic world, there is a lot of magic. What I mean by this? Like a child, the person with autistic thinking may assume that their needs are already satisfied. And this we can see in people with schizophrenia, who not only lack the energy sometimes to do something, but by this, their autistic thinking, they feel as if they want to eat, for example, they are already fat. If they want to drink, they have already drunk. They already had a drink, and that is the problem, because they may lie down on the floor, for example, and not eat at all. But in their mind, in their autistic world, it already happened. They're the best. They have no flaws. All their dreams are satisfied. So that's autistic thinking. What else? Now, symbolic thinking. Once again, the general concept may have an unusual meaning to the patient. For example, I may look out of the window and I'll say, oh, okay, you see that black car. Today somebody will die. Because I saw that black car, and black color means death. And I don't care that there is a million of these cars passing my window every day. I don't care that millions of other people see that car and nobody dies. For me, this is the reality. This is the correct and consequence of events. Black car, somebody dies. That is the symbolic thinking. Now, verbigerations and perseverations. So when we are talking about verbigerations, the person is repeating the last word they have said. For example, you ask them, what is your name? And they say like, Ivan Ivanovich. This is verbigeration. There are also perseverations, but perseverations are certain words which are persistent in the speech, and sometimes they may not even have a meaning. So I had this patient with schizophrenia who was adding the word Nakba at the end of all his sentences. But this word didn't mean anything. He just added it automatically. And also affective thinking. So I have touched this topic previously. So affective thinking comes not from logic, but from the emotions. So if I expect people to be bad towards me, I will see the bad context in all of their actions because I expect it, because I have this mood, this emotion inside of me. That is affective thinking. Okay. Now, the contents of thinking, the very ideas we are talking about may be disturbed. So, for example, there may be fixed ideas. So fixed ideas are extremely persistent ideas which the person tries to follow through, and they may be even obsessive at a certain point. So, for example, you may not want to think about killing your parents, for example, but this thought comes to you once and once and once again, and you may even try to do certain actions to make this thought go away. Maybe some day before it has worked for you. For example, you have closed the window 22 times, and the thought went away. And now each time when you have this thought, you try to close the window 22 times. But on the 22nd one, the thought doesn't go away. And you think, okay, maybe I did it wrong. I repeat everything from the start. So once again, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is the mechanism of obsessive thoughts, obsessions, and subsequent compulsions. The rituals which are used in order to get rid of the anxiety which is produced by these thoughts. Usually these thoughts are discordant with the personality of the person, so they don't want to think about it, they don't want to do this. But I need you to understand that the mechanism of compulsion is the sudden eruptance of the emotion in the consciousness from the unconsciousness. And when the person tries to get rid of this obsessive thought, they're just trying to push it deeper into consciousness, unconsciousness, and it comes back once again. So that's the mechanism. You push it, it comes back. You push it, it comes back. Usually the best way is not to resist the thoughts, because once again, yes, thoughts may be annoying, but they are not the reality. You make the thought the reality when you produce an action connected to this thought. And if you do not do anything, it is perfectly fine if you have these thoughts. So here is that. Also, there may be dominant ideas. Dominant ideas are usually not pathological ones, but they are very preferable for the person. The person doesn't struggle against these ideas, unlike with fixed ones. The person actually wants to think about those, but understand that it is not right in the context. For example, the woman who is at her job and she thinks about her ill child who was left at home. She understands she needs to focus on the work, but she has this need to know what is about her child. She is worried about them, and that is why she gets these dominant ideas. There are also overvalued ideas. Overvalued ideas, once again, are preferable by the personality. So you like to think about this, but they are overvalued. They do not have that much significance you put into it and that much connection with your life. I was prone to overvalued ideas. For example, I like to classify and order things, and especially classify people. And the thing was that once I start classifying a group of people, I cannot be stopped. I may be in transplant, I may be at work, but I understand that I need to get this process down and to end this, but I cannot switch before I end my work like this. So I start classifying everyone in the group, for example. That is a valid idea. This skill of classifying actually doesn't have that significance in my life, but I'm still stuck to it. So that is a valid idea. There are also delusion-like fantasies. So we are talking about this when we are observing children in psychosis, and sometimes it is very hard to make a difference between their games and the actual psychotic disorder. For example, there was this boy who was talking about being a captain of an army from the planet called Black, which waged the war against the planet called Yellow. You may say, yes, the child was just playing. That boy was 12 years old. So that 12-year-old boy was just playing pretend. But what if I say to you that actually because of this idea, he wasn't sleeping, he wasn't eating, because all these processes would disrupt his connection with his troops. So once again, the sign of disrupting vital needs and vital instincts of the person is present here. And that's why we say that this is a pathology. This is most likely delusion-like fantasy. Yes, there are also forced thoughts. So once again, they are connected with the obsessions, and the emphasis is on forced ones. So the person doesn't want to think about them, but they come. And also delusions. Oh, delusions, my favorite. So delusions are initially wrong judgments and conclusions which appear on a morbid basis. They are false beliefs, and they have no relation to the objective reality. They usually cannot be corrected. So when you try to disillusion the person who has delusions, it doesn't work. It only produces more and more aggression towards you. It's someone who opposes these ideas. Common to think that delusions are disorders of thinking, but I would say that disorder of thinking is the consequence of a certain state. Delusion always starts as a certain feeling, and only then, once again, it gets translated from this feeling into some form which can be transferred to another person in the words. So I get this feeling and I try to explain it. For example, one day I may start feeling that I am too smart. I have all the knowledge in the world. I feel as if I have read every book on this planet. I have all the knowledge from any library imprinted in my mind. I'm just so smart. I just cannot. I have this enormous knowledge inside of me. So I try to think, well, that's very strange. So why would I suddenly feel like this? And then I started thinking, okay, which smart people I know? Well, Nikola Tesla was smart. Yes, Nikola Tesla was a very smart physician. Maybe I'm Nikola Tesla. Yes, that explains everything. I'm so smart because I am actually Nikola Tesla. I will go right now to the local university and demand to be a lecturer there because I need to share this knowledge with other people because I'm just so great. So that is the basic link of development of the delusion. So at first there was a feeling which needed to be explained, and usually the person feels this very disturbed and very anxious before they get this explanation in the form of delusion, because they just cannot put up with this feeling. What is wrong with me? It may be a good state of the emotion, good condition, it may be bad feeling, but I have it and I need to name it. I need to understand what is happening with me. And then there is a delusion which helps to understand. As you can guess, the initial feeling and the subsequent delusion is usually a defensive mechanism against some emotion. So if I feel suddenly very grand, maybe I have felt very bad on another day, and this is the reaction. But when we are talking about psychosis, of course, it is a very strong reaction, a very extreme reaction of our organism, which cannot just be spooked away by the work of psychologists. No, it requires psychopharmacology. But I'm trying to explain you the logic how this comes to be. Okay, so there is a variety of different delusions. But first you need to understand that there is a primary delusion, which is interpretative, which happens right off the bat without any psychotic experiences. And there is also secondary delusion, sensual or imagery, when the person, for example, sees a hallucination of a death with a sight and starts explaining with the delusion that, okay, I have seen the death, probably I am her emissary. Yes, I am the emissary of the death. I will go and kill my neighbor because I am the emissary of the death. I need to obey her will. Something like this. So that is the secondary delusion. Once again, silent. Okay, so types of delusions. The type of delusion actually depends on the type of defense mechanism which lies at the core of this delusion. So you may talk about persecutive delusions. Persecutive delusions come from the mechanism of projection. So, for example, I have a lot of aggression towards other people, but I cannot be allowed to show this aggression. But I know that they persecute me. They try to hurt me. They try to poison me. They try to influence me by a race from the telephone and the internet. And now I will persecute them. I will defend myself because it is not me who is an aggressor. It is them. They have started it. They were trying to kill me, and I know it. That is the persecution, the projection. So I'm projecting my emotion onto others. The same thing happens in the delusion of reference, for example. Everything around has some relation to me. Those people in the back of the bus are whispering about me. That woman on the street, she looks at me somehow strangely. Maybe she knows that I have done some bad things. Yes, that is the delusion of reference. Also, what else? Yeah, the delusion of jealousy also can be of this type. So an alcoholic is convinced that their wife is cheating on them, but actually probably always had seductive wish to cheat themselves. Okay, so then there is delusion of influence. It is actually interesting. The influence may come from the other world, and and from the person themselves. So when we are talking about delusion of influence from the outer world, it is another form of persecutive delusion. So once again, they are influencing my thoughts. They can take my thoughts from my brain. They can make me feel things. They operate my body as if I am a robot. That is the delusion of influence. Or for example, I must say that I possess supernatural powers. I can heal people with my gaze, with my touch. I can, for example, I have all the knowledge in the world and I can share it. It is the delusion of influence, but from me. This is also, I would say, a variant of the delusion of grandeur. So I possess grand powers, grand skills. This type of delusion comes from the mechanism of introjection. So I introject, I possess skills, I possess certain traits, which I actually do not have. But if the person claims, for example, that I am Maria Skłodowska-Curie, I am Nikola Tesla, I am Napoleon, so I am someone great. This is the delusion coming from the process of inflation of the ego. So it is also a delusion of grandeur, but a delusion of identification. I identify with these grand people, and this makes me grand. Another variant of this will be the love delusion. For example, a famous actor is in love with me. A famous politician is in love with me. I'm affiliated with the wealthiest people on this planet. Once again, I identify with these people. I have some connection to them, and this makes me grand in my eyes. Because, like politicians do not choose just anyone to be their friend, right? So that's another thing. Also, there may be delusion of self-condemnation, self-humiliation, coming from the hyperexpression of negation mechanism. So we are not talking just about that, oh no, I feel like a bad person. No, the person may be so sad and self-humiliating that they will say that I am to blame for the war in Ukraine, for example. They will say, I am to blame for the famine in Africa. Have you heard about the fire on the factory? That's because of me. I'm so bad, and because of me, everybody is suffering. And you see that there is no logic here. You cannot be the source for all the sins on the planet. But for the person with the disorder, they are indeed the source for these sins. And what happens? Usually the person tries to project these emotions onto others, but fails to be aggressive towards others. So then they introject all these negative emotions, taking something more than just their own guilt. So that's what happens. Also, there may be hypochondriacal delusion. Hypochondria at its core arises when the person suppresses a lot of emotions, and these emotions become stored in the body of the person. And I'll just one thing beforehand, our emotions themselves are just a collection of sensations from our body. So when you try not to connect with these emotions in their whole form, you start to break them down into sensations. And these sensations may be very strange. These sensations may be very alien to you. And this makes you think that you may have some illness with you. For example, the person, and when the person is hypochondriacally delusioned, they will be not convinced by any analysis. You will show them that they have no problems with their organism, but they will still believe that they have these illnesses. And they may say the most like bogus ideas. For example, I got AIDS from that doorknob. I touched that doorknob, but now I have AIDS. Or for example, I contracted syphilis from my cat. So that's a delusion of hypochondriacal basis. Okay, and there is also a delusion of invention, another form of delusion of grandeur. When I possess powers, I have invented something very great, something very good. Look at me, I'm a great person. The same thing. Okay, I have talked about this. Okay. So yeah, you shouldn't try. What to do about delusions? You shouldn't try to oppose the person with delusions. Do not try to make them disillusioned in these ideas. It will only produce more anger. And once again, since it is a defense mechanism, there is something much more potent hidden under this idea. So you shouldn't try to strip the person of this idea. But you shouldn't play along either. I frequently hear from young psychiatrists this idea that you should play along with the delusions. No, you shouldn't. A especially if these delusions are violent. Because, okay, right now you play along with the person that somebody is spying on them, and the next day they will say that you are actually the spy, and they will try to kill you for this. So do not play along and do not oppose. You shouldn't take sides in this case, and especially when you are overall working with people, you do not take sides. You just listen. The person needs to talk about their delusional idea. Usually they just need to get this emotion out. They need to be heard for these emotions. And you can give them that. But you shouldn't confirm their delusions for your own safety. Not to mention that these patients, okay, if you think, but this patient is on drugs, they won't do anything to me. Yes, but they have their relatives, and their relatives may be very inducible, and they may believe this delusion as well, and they will come for you. And these relatives, you won't be able to deal with all the relatives at once. So once again, for your own safety, be very careful with delusional ideas. Okay, we were talking about this, talking about that, we were talking about that. Yeah, also, if you want to know about valid ideas, an example of it in practice, you may see the movie Taxist. It is a very old movie. It shows the person with schizotypal personality disorder and their overvalued idea of killing the president. Okay, so here is that, here is that. I have talked about this as well. Okay, so I have already mentioned that we judge the thinking from the speech of the person. But there are also different methods you can use practically in order to measure this function objectively. For example, classificational test. So in the test of classification, you will find picture that here, and this picture includes the sun, the lamps, and the candle, and the light bulb also. So the thing is that the patient should name all the subjects in one word. Here we test how they are able to do with abstract thinking and how they choose the traits upon which they classify the objects, because people with disturbances of thinking, they usually choose secondary traits which are not important and which are not usually used to classify objects. So here is that. Also, there is a test called the exclusion test. So, for example, there is a picture with the clock, glasses, wages, and also a thermometer. And on this picture, you are asked to exclude one object. Usually, we are not trying to find the correct answer here, but we are judging how the person solves this task. Because many people say, for example, that wages, that glasses are wrong because the glasses are not measuring anything. But I would provide you, for example, schizophrenic answer. I would say that the wages should be excluded because all other objects have glass in them. Thermometer, clock, glasses. But wages are made of metal. So that's a secondary trait used to classify objects. Also, there is a test of proverbs. So when we are using proverbs, we are usually measuring the way the person understands metaphors, different irony, like sarcasm, such things, and common symbolism. And this test is very important because sometimes this is the only thing which hints that the person has an illness. I don't remember if I talked about this patient before, but once again, I will talk about this case because it is just very, very good. Yeah, I was talking about this case in the previous topic when I was talking about the person with schizophrenia who showed no productive signs of this illness, but I used a verbal exam on them to find out that they have disorders of thinking. Yeah, I have mentioned in the previous lesson. Okay, there is also another test called syllogism. Yeah, about proverb exam, you name a proverb, and the person should explain you the meaning of this proverb. Now, syllogisms. Syllogisms are statements which are connected in a certain way, and the person needs to object or confirm the connection between these words. For example, all birds are animals, turkey vultures are birds, therefore all turkey vultures are animals. So you can confirm it or object this thing. Once again, that's the logic of the person. And there is also a pictograms exam. So there is a picture in the presentation with little pictures and sayings under them. So the person is asked to draw a symbol of a certain concept. For example, for love, the patient drew a little child because we love little children. Such thing. Okay. So no. Let's have a little break for 15 minutes and then we'll continue. We have stopped on the disorders of the intellect. Okay. So disturbances of intellect. Mostly we are talking about the intellect deficiency, and in this case there is a steady decrease in the level of intellect. Most often some of these illnesses and these disturbances are regarded as personality disorders because our intellect and our process of cognition influences all the other spheres. And I would urge you not to think about the intellect as just the smartness of the person. It is the ability to plan and organize your activity, first and foremost. There are two kinds of mental deficiencies. Some are innate and congenital, called oligophrenias, and some are acquired. They are called dementias. There are also grades of intellectual deficiency, and these grades mostly differ by the ability of the person to acquire professional skills and to care for themselves. So the lightest case is debility, with IQ of 50 till 69 points. These people usually do not differ much from other people. They may have diminished vocabulary and may talk and may have problems with abstract thinking, but they are perfectly able to find their workplace. They are able to acquire occupations, mostly physical ones, and they're able to care for themselves. They make families, so normal life, nothing different here. There is the problem with people with intellectual deficiencies also that they may be very suggestive, and this means that they easily fall under the influence of criminals and different marginal groups of people. Okay, now about imbecility. Imbecility is the second to severity grade, and with IQ from 20 till 49 points. These people usually have to be monitored, and they cannot acquire their skills. Their self-care is very, very basic. So they are like children their whole life. And there is also the level of idiocy. So with IQ less than 20 points. And these people are not able to work anywhere. They are not able to care for themselves. In the most severe cases, they just sit, with drool coming out of their mouth, and they have very little difference from the plants, unfortunately. That is a very sad situation, but I would say that emotionally they may react to other people, but they do not acknowledge that there are other people around. So that is a problem most of the times. An example of this, for example, there was a patient in my ward for chronically ill men who had underdeveloped speech organ, and he was just sitting there in the corner of the room, not talking with anyone, not reacting. He also had problems with coordination. At times he was very impulsive. So unfortunately he had to leave for the house for the people who are handicapped, but we couldn't refer him there because he was dangerous to others. He was very aggressive. So that's a person with an intellectual diminishment. Okay, what else? So how do we test intellectual level? Everybody has heard about IQ tests, but there are different types of IQ tests. One of the most famous ones is Raven's matrices, and you see in the presentation there are the sets of patterns, and the examinee should choose another link in the sequence of patterns. The problem with this test is that it mostly checks mathematical and logical thinking, which I think is not that important when we are trying to talk about the intellectual ability itself. So I prefer Wechsler's test. So Wechsler's test has two scales, verbal and performance scale, or non-verbal. and it tests a variety of functions, from memory to vocabulary to overall knowledge ability of the person, to the levels of attention, different um, spatial orientation, such stuff. So that's Wechsler test. Okay, now emotions, about emotions. I have already talked about emotions, that they are actually the integral image of different sensations in our body. We can feel our own emotions, and we can empathize to other people throughout reflecting their sensations in our body. So once again, we need to get in touch with our emotions in order to feel anything at all. Emotions may be very intense, and at first they become shut off from the consciousness in order for the person not to suffer consequences of these intense emotions, and later on they become a problem for the body, because this tension doesn't disappear. It is the energy which should find their way out. There are some people say that they don't have emotions, for example. That's not true. If you have hormones in your body, if you have neuromediators in your body, you have emotions. Another question is that, are you conscious of your emotions or not? About psychopaths, also psychopaths are famous for not having emotions, but actually they lack empathy for other people, and they lack ability to feel guilt, because they are very good at repressing it. But once again, I have already mentioned, emotions do not go anywhere. They are stored in our body. So the person who feels enormous guilt will start traumatizing themselves intentionally or unintentionally. But they may not feel guilt because of it. They will just, for example, fall down the stairs and break their leg suddenly for some unknown reason, without having any problems with coordination whatsoever before the incident. So that's the implication of the guilt, which is stored in the body and not released, for example. So our emotions usually affect our whole psychic life, our behavior, our facial expression, our movement, our speech, and the rate of our thinking. That's why people with depression, for example, they have problems with their thinking, because our emotions influence our whole body throughout the hormones. So when we are looking at the person, we can check the integrity of their emotional functions. For example, if they are sad, they should have an appropriate emotional expression of their face, of their body, of their thinking and speech. If they are euphoric, you will see it as well. If there is a certain break in this integrity, it is a sign of a certain pathology. But we'll look through these pathologies as well later. Okay, so emotions can be divided also into mood, which are prolonged emotional states, and affect, which are short-term, very intense, usually of defensive measure, and usually with diminished control over their reaction. Affect is very important because it also has a very big role in gestures, and that's why we differ the physiological effect and pathological effect. Physiological effect is an intense emotion, and which usually has a defensive measure, and the person doesn't lose control throughout this physiological effect. Also, the person after the physiological effect has the memory of what was happening. So, as you can see, there is no problem with consciousness here. The person was conscious of what was happening with them. I have experienced physiological effect myself because I was raped at the age of 2, and that's why when I was placed in the circumstances which bear resemblance with the ones where I was traumatized, I reacted out of these emotions. And what was happening with me? Suddenly, I felt this intense urge to hurt the person which was around me, and I was with a little child of 4 years old, because I was at the age of my aggressors and the child was little. So I felt the urge to hurt this child very badly, to kill him and kill him by strangling. And I was very scared at the moment, because this emotion, it is so strong that you feel as if you would cease to exist unless you give exit to this emotion, unless you express it in some way. It is so intense. It is an intense fear for your life at that moment. So at that moment also the time feeling distorted for me, because I was able to think about a lot of things in the mere seconds, because I felt that I'm losing control over my body. So unless I think about something what to do, I will indeed hurt the child, but I didn't want to. But I had this emotion which was governing me. So at that moment, also my field of vision was changed. I only saw what was on the sides of my vision, but here everything was blurred. Everything was in this strange blob of gray matter, and I didn't see anything, but only on the sides. So luckily at that moment when this situation arose, um, I have remembered an article from the Wikipedia about compulsions, where it was said that if you want to prevent the compulsion from happening, you should change the, like substitute the action with something similar. And since we were standing in the bathroom, I quickly suggested the boy to wipe out the water from his hands, because we were washing our hands. And when I did this, luckily, I just squeezed his hands, not his neck, but his hands. And this relieved some of this emotion I was having. And my vision returned to me after 5 minutes after this situation. I was feeling very weakened, and I was very scared still, because I didn't really understand what was happening with me. But right now, it's like I understand. This is physiological effect. And of course, I remember it, so it is physiological effect. I had some control over my actions. But, and later, I also checked in Wikipedia. There is no such article, which I remembered. So my psyche somehow helped me to get out of this situation without any victims. But this is what happens with people with intense emotions. When you have traumas you haven't worked out, when you have intense stress, this is what can happen with you. But when we talk about pathological effect, it is a whole other idea. The person in pathological effect usually gets these intense emotions from the chaotic action of the nervous circuits. There is no control and no conscious overview of the actions, and the person usually falls into deep sleep after the pathological effect time, because it's a certain disorder of the consciousness and emotions. Sometimes it is combined with twilight state of consciousness, which is a disturbance of consciousness, and I will be talking about it. And in this state, unfortunately, people may commit crimes. For example, there was this woman with epilepsy who has fallen into the twilight state, and she murdered her husband out of this state. And when she came back to her senses, she was mortified to see her husband dead, because she loved him, and she couldn't understand that this was happening to her. So that is pathological effect. In the law, in the court, people with pathological effect are deemed irresponsible of their actions committed during this period, during the period of effect. Unlike people with physiological one. If you kill somebody out of fury, unfortunately, you will be convicted. But if you have killed somebody because you were hallucinating at that point and you didn't really see the connection with reality, that's a whole other idea. You would be convicted to get placed in the hospital and to be treated. Okay. Not to mention that emotions, yeah, also, if somebody tries to simulate and then justifies that that was physiological, that was pathological effect, not physiological one, remember about amnesia. Remember that this is a sudden thing, so the person doesn't have any ability to plan the actions in pathological effect. So people who clean up after murdering somebody and then claim that they did this in pathological effect, this is lies. And also there is an autonomic response, a change of color of the skin because of the dilation of the vessels, the change in the blood pressure, in the heart rate, in the rate of breathing, all these signs, respiration, things the person doesn't control consciously are affected here. So that's what you should pay your attention at. Okay, also emotions can be a asthenic effect, so they may make you weaker, or they may be sthenic, strength. And usually our anger is the emotion needed to overcome obstacles because it gives us strength. Another form of anger is fear. So when you see the obstacle and you understand that you cannot overcome it, you try to run. You feel fear from this obstacle. And another phase of fear and anger is sadness. You cannot run from the obstacle, you cannot overcome it. You succumb to this feeling and you feel worthless and sad. There's the meaning behind it. Okay, so what can be the result can be in the strength of emotion. So for example, there may be strengthening of positive emotions. Hyperthemia. The person feels elevated mood, but in the state of hyperthemia, the person usually is able to critically assess their actions and it doesn't interfere with their usual life and with their vital needs. But when we are talking about the euphoric person has elevated mood which doesn't depend on the outside factors. So for example, you will take the person in the mania that their dear mother had died, and the person will still love their lives off without any change because they're euphoric. This person also would not be able to work because they don't need to. They feel just so great. They don't need to earn money. They don't need anything to feel so great. So that's euphoria. They stop sleeping because they feel full of energy out of euphoria. That is pathological strengthening. Then there is also another type of it called ecstasy, but ecstasy is more intense and more short-lived. So if euphoria is mood, ecstasy is like affect. And ecstasy can be religious, for example, when the person feels ecstatic from being close to God or something like this. And a lot of states in schizophrenia can be ecstatic actually at the moment, as well as truly devastating and catastrophic in other situations. Okay, now the opposite may be hyperthemia, for example. So the person feels a little bit depressed, a little bit low-mooded, but they still can work, they still can care for themselves, but like just their mood is low. So that's hyperthemia. The extreme manifestation of this is depression. So the person feels so bad, so low on energy that they are not able to get up from their bed. They just lying there all day. They do not take baths because they cannot get to the bathroom. They do not want to eat. They cannot work. It is painful just to open your eyes. That's how depression feels. Also about depression and euphoria. Well, when I will be talking about the syndromes, I will stop on them in a little bit detail. Right now, I'm talking only about emotions. There is also anxiety. So if you talk about fear or phobia, fear usually has a focus on a certain object, but you need to understand that usually phobias are not of certain objects. These objects are not original ones. It is a substitution of something which has scared you before. For example, I was scared of earthworms for a long time because they reminded me of genitalia. But I rationalized it why I was scared of worms. And when we worked with this trauma, my fear of worms has subsided because it was a substitution. So when we are talking about anxiety, there is no clear object here. Everything is fearful. The person is scared of something happening, something unexpected. They're just constantly tense. So here the original object and even the substitute for it is unconscious. The person cannot retrieve what they're scared about or they're scared of. Also, eyefulness. So eyefulness can be paired with hypersensitivity, so the person becomes exposed to every minuscule thing. And you need to understand that in bipolar affective disorder, there are not only mania and depression, there are also mixed states. And in this state, the person experiences eyefulness, and they still may laugh. They will be very the thing is that happiness in mania usually it is the last effort of the person to get a grasp on life, which only gives them misery. It is an effort to run away from these sensations of being self-humiliating, or the sensation of being in despair. And when they start to come back to the state of despair, the mixed state arises, and later depression. So you shouldn't be fooled by their smiles and their activity. It is not because the manic person is happy. It is because they're in great pain, and they just try to run away from it as hard as they can, while they still can. Okay, I have talked about this. Yeah, also apathy. Apathy is the absence of affect. So the person doesn't feel any mood, doesn't have any inclination to something. That's apathy. They're indifferent to the outside world. Yeah, there may be also pathological weakening. So apathy is a variant of this, but there is also paralysis of emotions. So when we are talking about paralysis of emotions, it is usually acute state when the person, for example, they understand means that the emotion is cut off, the consciousness of the person, because it is just so intense that it is best for the person not to feel it. So that's why the emotion is paralyzed. For example, on the funeral of a dearest person to you, such things. Okay, and there are also emotional flattening and emotional bluntness. So what is the difference? Emotional bluntness is the loss of differentiation of emotional response. So for example, people who suffer from addictions at the late stages of psychogenic syndrome, they may become unvaried in their reactions to other people. They will tell dirty jokes with their friends and with the authority figures, because they just don't have this difference in their emotional response. So their response is even in different situations. That is bluntness, emotional bluntness. When we are talking about emotional flattening, it is usually connected with schizophrenia and its impact on the emotions. But it is not like the person just loses all emotions and it happens suddenly. No, there are grades to it. A perfectly balanced normal person usually reacts emotionally with their mimics, and reacts with their mimics vividly both on their own experiences and at the experiences of other people. So we can see that their empathy is working. If something happens with their expression or with their empathy, we'll see the changes. So for example, the person will not react emotionally to the other people's suffering, other people's situations, but will still have some reaction towards their own experiences. So here we see that there is a problem with empathy, but the expression, emotional expression, is still here. In the late stages, the person loses the expression as well. So they do not produce a vivid emotional response towards their own situation. And you should be very attentive towards this, because sometimes patients need very specific situations which they will show you that they still have this function intact. When I was working with patients in my ward, there was this patient with schizophrenia who was deemed emotionally flat in his diaries. So when I was talking to him, I indeed noticed that he did not react emotionally, like expressionally, at me. But then I asked him what was his favorite meal. And when he tried to answer me to this question was unexpected to him, because nobody has ever asked him about this. Everybody just wants to know how he feels and what about his voices and stuff and his medications, but not his favorite meal. So when he was thinking about his favorite meal, and he likes dumplings from his mother, he told me, he started smiling when he was thinking about this food. So he has emotional response. He is not emotionally flat. He is midway in this process, but he still has these emotions. And this means that we can anchor at this state and try to help him with other missed functions when he have at least some function intact. You should be very attentive, and you should ask all sorts of questions to your patients. Do not forget that they are personalities. They are people with histories, people with lives, and people with lives, and they will appreciate it if you ask them about such stuff. Okay, I have talked about this as well, and this, yeah, also ability of emotions. Usually we can control our emotions, for example, but sometimes this control is not possible for us. And for example, our emotions may be changeable very quickly. So the person who is emotionally mobile will cry when they want to cry and then laugh at the second minute after they cry and without any trace of the tears. But there is always a reason for this reaction. So these people are just hyper-reactive to the situations. There may be also pain. So person which start crying at their birthday because they're just so happy to see all the family gathered around and just they cannot contain the tears. That's faint-heartedness. There may be also inertness or stickiness of emotional feelings. This is very evident with people with paranoid accentuation personality and paranoid psychopathy. So it's a very long time for this emotion to subside. Sometimes weeks, sometimes months. They will remember that you have wronged them in the previous, like last week in the on Wednesday. They will remember it. And they will tell you about it, and they will be angry at you for this whole week. That is stickiness of emotions. There may be also explosiveness. So, oh, that's siren. Also, there may be explosiveness. For example, the person reacts very intensely on every minuscule thing, just like erupts like a volcano. That is explosiveness. Yes, it is the siren. You may not hear it, but I can hear it. Okay, so there is also a certain congruence of emotions and the context. And once again, when this link between your reaction and the stimuli is missing, this is usually the sign of a loss of the connection with the world. So, for example, emotions will be inadequate. The person with schizophrenia may laugh at the funeral and may cry at the happy day. And it is not like when, for example, people cannot contain tears of joy because these people understand that this is inappropriate. The person can actually stop. The person with schizophrenia cannot control this reaction and cannot stop once it is on. There is also dysphoria. So dysphoria is a very gloomy, angry, sad mood, which is once again very sudden and lasts for a certain amount of time and then is off without any trace. It is mostly typical for people with epilepsy. There is also dysthymia. So dysthymia is like chronically down mood, which doesn't reach the level of depression. So the person once again is able to work and to live peacefully, but they are just very sad all the time. You may have seen those people whose style in life is just to be sad at everything. There is also pathological effect, we have talked about this, and ambivalence. So you may have heard from teenagers who say that, you know, I love my parents, but sometimes I hate my parents. This is normal ambivalence when you are conscious of your contradicting stimuli, but you are able to choose the side. You are not torn between them, because of course these teenagers love their parents overall, but they hate their parents and they argue, for example. But when we are talking about pathological ambivalence, the emotions of different polarities are equally strong and they are disinhibited from the unconscious. Because, for example, when I'm happy, my sadness is usually inhibited in the unconscious. But for the person with schizophrenia, this becomes free and they are constantly conscious of these contradictions. And because they are equally strong, they are not able to choose a side. And this leads to ambivalence when the person, to the ambitendency, when the person cannot choose between two contradictive behaviors and may behave chaotically. For example, they may hug you 1 second and then push you away at the very second because they are also repulsed by you. I have experienced this thing when I went to the shop, once again during my not very good period in my life, and I had these shelves with the products I needed to buy, and I had the list of these products. in my hand. I knew what I needed to buy. I could take any product I needed, but I just couldn't choose because I can start from this product and from this and from this and from this and from this, and I need all of them. And I know that I have this list. I have everything in order. I can start with the top one and finish with the down or with the bottom one, but I just couldn't choose because I was torn apart by these things. Another example of this will be, for example, when choosing to turn right or left. I couldn't choose, so I was just turning around and walking in a big circle in order to get somewhere where I needed. That's an example of ambivalence and ambitendency. Okay, I have talked about this as well. Okay, so how do we study emotions actually? So to study emotions, we need to conduct different tests, not just observation. There is, for example, Spielberg's test for anxiety and depression. There is also hospital anxiety and depression scale, the same way. Those are questionnaires and they take some time to be filled. There is also Lasher's test of color choices. So there is a set of specifically designated colors from which the person needs to choose what is happening to them. And you then have a clear interpretation of each color, and this reflects the state of the person at the moment. Also, story reproduction, because the person distorts the story to the effect they are having at the time of reproducing the story. And also thematic perception test. During thematic perception test, there is an assortment of pictures with plots, for example, people doing something, and the person, the examinee, needs to explain what is happening on the picture. So here is that. Okay. No, what now? Okay, so I suggest we talk about the factor evolutionary sphere. Then I will talk about the disorders of consciousness. I'm thinking how to point this more effectively, because there is a lot of different syndromes. Okay, I am planning to talk about the disorders of affective evolutional sphere, then a little break, then I'll continue with the disorders of consciousness and all the psychopathological syndromes. It's best to do it like this, because unfortunately my throat can bear with this tempo. But good thing, we will be able to finish everything in one go, I suppose. That's a very, very, very good thing. Okay, so let's continue. Affective volitional sphere. So this is about how we move and what for we move. So our movement and our drives. What can happen with our drives? These drives include the self-preservation instinct, the drive to fetch food, for example, sleeping, sexual activity, such stuff. So about food drives, there may be intensification, for example, when the person needs to eat constantly. It is called polyphagia and bulimia. We are talking about bulimia when the person also pairs the consumption of big amounts of food with then. Okay, I hope that the previous part of the stream wasn't torn away. I really hope. Fortunately, the connection here is not so great. Okay, so I was talking about bulimia. The person who is bulimic is eating out of impulse, not because they want to. Usually they consume food they wouldn't normally eat, and in the amounts which they cannot take. That's why they vomit afterwards. The Opposite thing is weakening of the food impulse. So anorexia, the person doesn't get impulse to eat food or restricts it because of some ideas. Often bulimia and anorexia are paired. There is also polydipsia. Polydipsia is occasional big consumption of alcohol in the absence of alcoholism. So, for example, the person was sober many years, then 1 month they are drinking like the drunkard, and they are sober again after this month. That's polydipsia. Usually it is regarded as an equivalent of epilepsy or other paroxysmal disorders. Also, there may be a perversion of food drive. So, for example, parorexia, when the person consumes food or objects which are usually not edible and maybe even dangerous. So, coprophagia, for example, or for example, urinophagia, or for example, the person may eat nails, buttons, safety pins, needles. And this is, once again, another sign that this is pathological because the person is harming themselves throughout this food. Cannibalism is also another of this, but I would say that all the things which are to do with food are always connected with the person trying to accept something, to identify with something. Because when you try to cannibalize somebody, you are becoming this person, so you're trying to accept themselves. But it is the primitive form. On the higher spiritual level, we are trying to connect with the other person through emotions, yes, through reflexia, through empathy, through our shared hobbies and interests. But why should I bother with knowing other person when I can just eat them? That's easier. That is a more primitive way of behavior. Coprophagia, on the other hand, is also a primitive way of behavior because usually with feces, usually children play with feces at a certain point of their life, and usually this passes. If it persists, we are talking about infantilism in the person's behavior. Okay, so here is that. Self-preservational instinct can be also at the fault here. For example, it may intensify and the person will become overly aggressive, overly defensive, or may, for example, stop moving at all and play dead. That is, once again, this is what happens actually with the person who is suffering from catatonia, because if you observe people falling into catatonic stupor when they are not moving, you'll see that at first they are very scared of everything, they are very anxious, and only later it proceeds to the full stop of the movement of the person. It is not sudden, it is very steady and very fluid. There is also weakening of self-preservational instinct, so the person may commit suicidal acts. And I'll be talking about suicides later on when we talk about depression, because it is just a very complex thing. And also there may be a perversion of self-preservation, self-torture. In the more extreme forms, when the people are piercing themselves with needles and cutting themselves with knives, or drinking acid, for example, and in the more mild forms, for example, people who deprive themselves of sleep, people who do not eat, who consume food which is dangerous for them. So it is of self-torture actually, not only the extreme forms but also mild ones. Also, there may be disturbances of sexual drives in the form of paraphilias. So, and I would say, once again, because it is connected with identification of the person, anything can be desired sexually, anything. Animals, zoophilia, children, pedophilia, corpses, necrophilia, all of this stuff. And I also need you to understand that sometimes the person may exhibit a distortion of drives, but the main problem may not lie in this symptom. The symptom is not the illness in this case. What I mean by this, you may have heard about the newspapers calling some old guys perverts because they suddenly start molesting little girls at the age of 70 or something like this. And everybody talks like, oh, I have known this person for my whole life. I could have never guessed that they are pedophile. Because they are not a pedophile. Their brain is too old to differentiate the age of the object in front of them. And this is the problem, because I have mentioned it before. When our brain gets old, many functions become malfunctioning. Sorry for the repeat here. And so it is not that this guy likes little girls right now. No, it is because He sees a female object, a female person, but fails to recognize that this female person is immature and you cannot woo this girl because she's 6 years old. So that's the difference here. So in this case, we are talking about pseudo-pedophilia, pseudo-paraphilia, not real paraphilia. Also, actions can be obsessive. Once again, compulsive actions, which I have already explained. Ritualistic actions, which need to be repeated in a certain pattern in order to relieve the person from anxiety. Becoming, as a result, a self-contained symptom because they do not serve their purpose anymore, and they only decrease the quality of life of the person. And there are also forced actions when the person feels the sudden urge to do something. For example, I feel that I need to jump from the roof, and I put all my efforts in order not to do this while standing on the roof, but I feel that I want to jump. This is the forced action. And there is also impulsive action. So impulsive actions, they do not pass consciousness at all. The person doesn't even get the chance to react. They just do it. They get the impulse to hit somebody, they hit it. They hit them. And this is often the problem for our patients, why many people think that our patients are dangerous because of impulsive actions. And once again, these actions don't come from ill will. They come from the disorder of movement. So here is that. Okay. We have talked about this, we have talked about that. So there may be also disturbances of motives. So when we're talking about motives, we are talking about will. So there may be too much of the will. So hyperbulia. What about hyperbulia? When the person is hyperbolic, they are putting a lot of efforts towards one goal, and they may ignore all the other influences. For example, warriors on the warfield who run towards the commander of the opposing army without looking at the pain from their broken limbs and from the bullets penetrating their body. That is hyperbulia. Also, there may be such thing as parabulia. So when the person is insistent to pursue to get to the goal, which is based upon delusional ideas and upon ill logic. For example, the person may think that they are being spied on and they're being persecuted, and so they change their address, they move out to another country or even like to the jungle, and they live there even though it is very hard because they're very insistent on getting away from the imaginary danger. Also, stalkers who are very fixated on the object of their love, and they want to go after this person and to be with them constantly and always. And this is once again an example of parabulia. They may even miss meals and stay long hours outside the window of their love just to observe them. That is an example of parabulia. The opposite may be hypobulia. So when the person doesn't have the inclination to do something, and this is different from, for example, a depressive person. So when the person is depressed, they are asthenic. They do not have energy to do anything. But the person with apatho-abulic syndrome, with apathy and abulia, they do not have the mood, the inclination to do anything. They have the energy. They just don't want to do anything. And I have talked about ambitendency already. Okay. Now, about motor activity in details, what can happen with the way we move? For example, the person may fall into catalepsy. So, cataleptic person will save the pose you put them in. So, for example, it is also called the wax movement. For example, the person is in stupor and you try to change their pose, you change it and they remain in this pose, even though it is very uncomfortable and it is very hard for the person to stand like this. This is a sign of catatonia, and I will be talking about catatonia even more. And what you need to understand is that the person in catatonia isn't using their usual muscles in order to stand like this. They are making tense, they're antagonizing groups of muscles and more deep layers of muscles in order to withstand long hours in these poses, because people can stand in uncomfortable poses for 7 hours, for 8 hours in a catatonic stupor, being cataleptic. Another sign of catatonia is hood sign. For example, example, the person will put the blanket over their head as if it is a hood and stay like this. Usually this is done in order to prevent the voices from being heard. Also, there is passive subjective state. So how is it tested? For example, I come to the patient, I take the needle and I tell them, put out your tongue so that I will put this needle in your tongue. And the person obeys, even though they understand that this is harmful for them. That is passive subjective state. Also, there may be negativism. So negativism is another sign of catatonia. And what about negativism? It may be active or it may be passive. In active negativistic state, the person does the opposite thing of what they are told to. For example, I come to the patient and I tell them, do not hug my hand. And they do this. That's active negativism. Or negativism may be passive. For example, the person just doesn't obey your instructions. You tell them, raise your hand, and the person stays still without raising their hand. Another sign of catatonia is mutism. So the person doesn't talk, even though everything is fine with their speech organs and with their thinking. Sometimes mutism can arise as well in psychogenic situations. For example, the person who was laughed at while giving public speech may be reluctant to talk afterwards. Okay. And there are also specific disorders in the development of school skills, such as dyslexia when the person has problems with reading, dysgraphia when the person has problems with writing, dyscalculia when the person has problems with making mathematical operations, or alcalculia when the person just cannot do any arithmetical calculations, and dyspraxia when the person has problems with their coordination. Why I'm talking about these symptoms? Because we need to differentiate, for example, high steroid stupor, factogenic stupor, and catatonic one. In catatonic one, you'll see additional symptoms. Negativism, always, mutism, passive subjective state, good sign, catalepsy at times, but not always. Now, also, there may be excitement in our motor activity. So there may be hyperkinetic disorders, for example, tics, which are involuntary. There may be impulsiveness. Once again, the person gets any impulse to do something and they do this without any thinking. There may be stereotypes, so the person is repeating a certain movement, but this is not a tic which comes and goes in successions. Stereotypes are just used movements which the person repeats. There is also echopraxia. Echopraxia is very important. So it is one of the group of symptoms where, once again, the border between yourself and the self of other person gets erased. So the person with echopraxia, and echopraxia is also a catatonic symptom, repeats the movements of other people as if they were their own. Not like the mirror, but as if they were these people. So, for example, I raise my right hand and the patient raises the right hand. This is echopraxia. Also, there is, I have talked about this. There is also such thing as echoalia, when the person repeats words said by another person. Once again, the border between myself and other self is erased. Now, I have talked about catatonic stupor. There is also psychogenic stupor. So there was a story about the guy from India who has raised his hand to praise the god Shiva, and he promised not to put his hand down for his whole life. So he still has his hand up. This is psychogenic stupor. There may be also apathetic stupor when the person just doesn't have the inclination to move at all. And there is also depressive stupor. And the person in depressive stupor may follow you with their eyes, but they will not walk around, not move. So here is that. Okay, now about excitement. Catatonic excitement. When we are talking about catatonic excitement, the person becomes hyperactive in their movements, but these movements bear no practical use at all. The person may just flail wildly on the floor without any usage, without any control, and it doesn't depend on the context at all, out of context. There may be maniacal excitement because the person feels so energetic. They want to be very active. They want to be productive. They do everything and they fly from one activity to another. That's maniacal excitement. There is also hebephrenic excitement. Once again, no practical reason, unlike maniacal one, when the person tries to complete some goals. A hebephrenic person will just grimace a lot, and all in all, their behavior reminds clowning, because for their autistic world, this is funny. For other people, it is not. There may be hallucinatory delirious excitement, which is usually aligns with the fabula of the delusion and with the topic of the hallucination. For example, if I see a lion walking towards me, I would run from this lion because I'm scared. And there may be excitement in the disturbances of consciousness, which is totally automatic and usually, once again, bears defensive measures. Okay. So, also about personality. Personality is the accumulation of a lot of factors. It is our innate temperament, our traits of character. The character is actually the set of attitudes towards ourselves, other people, our occupation, and the objects in this world, and also our values. And also, it is our individual experience which makes somebody a personality. We consider personality with a variety of different tests. Some of them are more valid, some are not, like socionics, for example. But I will talk about some of them. So, Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory. This is a very cool test, especially for psychopathies and accentuations of the character traits. There is only one problem. It has over 100 questions. I used to do this test each month, and really I hate it. I cannot even understand how our patients are supposed to do this, because you just need a lot of concentration to this test. But it is very good. So here's that. Also, Dan Rubinstein's unfinished proposals. In these proposals, there are sets of sentences which are united by a certain topic, like family, for example, sexual life, and the patient needs to continue these sentences. There is also zombie test, and you will find a fragment of this test in the presentation. It is a set of cards with pictures of mentally ill people, and the examinee should choose two portraits they like and two portraits they are repulsed by. And this reveals a certain situation of their drives. I love zombie test very much. And there is also Rorschach test, or ink blot test. You might have heard about it. And it is not like that we interpret it in our own way each time. There is a very big book like this, which tells us what each interpretation means for the patient. So it is a very good test, a very complex one. Okay, so we can start at consciousness. Let's have a 20-minute break, and then we'll continue, because I'm just too tired already, and my vocal cords need to have some break. I hope the stream doesn't break while I'm away. So 20-minute break.
Кстати, свою булочку доедай. Ты когда открываешь дверь, руками не лапай стекло, ладно? Помыла его.
open the presentation. Probably today I won't be filming another because once again it is too late. I'm already very tired. Okay, so now about consciousness. Consciousness is the integrative sphere of our psychic activity, and it helps us to basically give the name to all our unconscious processes and to reflect on ourselves and on on the outer world. The meaning we give this world, we give through consciousness. And if it is disturbed, there is a very big problem. So once again, disorders can be divided into qualitative and quantitative. When we are talking about quantitative changes of consciousness, they are mostly about reduced alertness of our consciousness from torpor to coma. And I'll be talking about those. When we're talking about quality changes, we mean the change of the contents of the consciousness. And here we can see, for example, that the person interacts not with the real world, but with the world of their delusions and hallucinations. Okay, so when we're talking about non-psychotic forms, non-productive forms, when there are no hallucinations, no delusions in the form of consciousness, we are talking about disengagement of consciousness. So the types of this disengagement include obnubilation, when the threshold of excitation of the nervous system is raised. And so when, for example, you need to talk louder for the person to hear you, you need to be active in your attempts to make contact with the person. That's obnubilation. Then there comes somnolence. The person in somnolence becomes sleepy, and they will sleep unless disturbed. Usually they react onto the stimuli, especially painful ones. And sometimes somnolence can go into sopor. So when the person is in sopor, it is very hard to wake them up. Mainly they react only on painful stimuli, but others like sounds, light, no use. The person is sleeping. Their consciousness is off. And when you see that the person loses their reflexes, when you see pathological reflexes arising, when you see that the person doesn't react at pain, then probably the person is in coma. So that is the last stage of disturbance of consciousness in this scale. Now, there is also such state as fainting, which is a very short-lived state, loss of consciousness due to the different changes in our brain. So usually it is not that scary. Okay, so I have witnessed sopor once when I was working in the first psychotic episode ward, and there was this student admitted who got poisoned by drugs in the club, and he was constantly sleeping, and I couldn't wake him up to talk to him. Okay, and now on to productive forms, when we have hallucinations or delusions present here, and or delirium present in the structure of the change of consciousness. This include delirious syndrome, oneroid syndrome, syndrome of asthenic confusion, syndrome of perplexity, amentia, and twilight state of consciousness, which are various subtypes of twilight state of consciousness. Asthenic confusion comes from the weakness of the organism, and such patients, for example, may start being very clear in their consciousness and being very alert to your questions and stuff, but progressively their attention becomes very dizzy. They do not react adequately to your questions and may even miss any answers or something like this. So that is asthenic confusion. Syndrome of perplexity is very common at the start of delirium, very common among people with dementia, for example, with amnesic disorientation, when the person feels bewildered and alienated from the outside world. Everything feels strange, everything feels changed somehow. That is syndrome of perplexity. If you talk about amentia, in this state, the person is little bit. Okay, let me just list all of those, and then I will get into details about them because there is a lot to talk about. So, yeah, about different types of twilight state. Twilight state can be divided into different types. For example, simple form or ambulatory automatism, somnambulism. It can have a psychotic form. It can be a pathological effect. It can be a pathological intoxication. It can be in the form of drowsiness, in the form of short circuit response, and in the form of hysterical twilight states, such as pluralism, pseudodementia, and Ganser syndrome. So now let's talk about each of those in details. Delirium usually arises upon the basis of intoxication, which can come from different things. It can come from infections like encephalitis, meningitis, syphilis. It can come from withdrawal, for example, for alcoholics. It can come from acute metabolic syndrome, for example, in case of acidosis, electrolyte disturbance, hepatic failure. It can come from trauma, for example, head or burns, from the hypoxia, from the different deficiencies, for example, vitamin B12 deficiency, niacin deficiency, thiamine, environmental influences like thyroid, adrenopathies, environmental, that's endocrinopathies. Also from vascular things like hypertensive emergency, subarachnoid hemorrhages, different toxins, drugs, and also heavy metals like lead or mercury. So you can see the etiology is various, but the clinical picture is one. Okay. So about delirium, let me, also oneroid. So the difference between oneroid and delirium is that in delirium, the person doesn't lose their autopsychic orientation. They only lose the our psychic one. So they cannot orient on the surroundings, but they understand who they are and what is their personality and what are their interests and so on and so forth. In oneroid, the person, for example, unfortunately loses the integrity of their own personality and their experiences become fragmented. So they are not only our psychically disoriented, but also disoriented in themselves. I'll be talking about that in a minute. Okay. Also, in delirium, usually the person is very active physically. They start to move around, they try to run away from the hallucinations, while in oneroid, the person usually observes their situation because their focuses of the neural impulses are different. For the delirium, the impulses mostly come from the left hemisphere, and for the oneroid, the impulses mostly come from the right hemisphere, hence the difference in behaviors. Okay. I talked about this, I have talked about that, I have talked about this, and about that, and about this. Okay, so about delirium, how it develops. Usually the symptoms of delirium become very clear mostly till the evening. At first the person is anxious. They may experience problems with their sleep. They will have nightmares. They will also see pareidolias, if you remember the previous lessons, so pareidolic illusions. Their responses are accelerated and very animated. Their emotions are vivid and expressiveness is exaggerated. Also, you'll see the vegetal vascular changes, so the color of the face may change. They will be sweating with very big drops of sweat. Then illusions can change into hallucinations in the moment of falling asleep, but mostly all the action happens at night. During the day, the person may be lucid, and through the progress of this state, this lucidness becomes more and more rare. Okay. also, usually the person in delirium remembers very clearly and very vividly what they have experienced in their hallucinations, but they do not remember what was happening around them. They may not recognize where they are at the height of the delirium. Okay, we talked about this. We talked about this as well. Yeah, and at the height of the delirium, the person cannot fall asleep at all. They are very active at night. They may become aggressive because they're scared. We have talked about this, we talked about that. Yeah, there are two grave forms of delirium. One is called occupational and another is called muttering. Muttering delirium occurs within the bed. The person doesn't run around, but they squirm in their bed, and you may see that they are trying to get something off them. Usually they do not even look where they are touching themselves. So that is muttering delirium. Occupational delirium is a delirium where the person is stuck performing actions which are usual for their occupation. For example, if the person works on the computer, they will be typing like this. So here is that. When we are trying to help with delirium, usually we need to refer to the treatment of detoxification for the person. But I will be talking about this in detail when we will discuss alcoholic addiction. Okay, now about oneroid. Oneroid is also gradual and goes through a series of successive stages. At the initial period, there are mostly affective disorders, so the person may be depressed, they are also irritable, they have a lot of anxiety, they feel weakened. Sometimes a maniacal state may even appear. What else? And this stage lasts for several weeks to several months. So you can imagine how hard it is to find out that the person is falling into the oneroid state at this stage. Then there is the stage of delusional mood. So surroundings seem incomprehensible, strange, alien to the patient. The patient has almost feeling about everything. It's very suspicious. Okay, they may develop delusional ideas at this moment of persecution, for example, of hypochondria, of being seriously ill, something like this. Sometimes there is a sensation that there is some plot going around. There is some stage being put for the person, as if it is all a big grand movie or like a play stage. Okay, and these symptoms increase and may last for several weeks. At the stage of unoriented oneroid, the real events, the real world still exists, but the patient alongside this real world perceives some pictures, hallucinations of this story they will be witnessing in their mind. They may change from their psychomotorical excitement to substupor and may be in the state of depression. At the stage of extensive oneroid, the fantastic representations based on the visual hallucinations before the inner's eye, they substitute the real world, and the person is no longer in the contact with the real world. The reduction of this oneroid is gradual. Okay, we have talked about this. Memory can be preserved or cannot, but of course the real world doesn't exist at this moment for the patient. Okay, we have talked about this. Yeah, also. Okay, we have talked about this. Okay, pathological prosomniac states. This is a variant of twilight state consciousness when the person isn't fully awake. So the motor disinhibition occurs, but the consciousness is still asleep. In this state, one woman has killed her children and was drying the intestines on a rope as if those were coals. And when she finally woke up, she was very scared to find out what she had done. So this is pathological prosomniac state. And this is a part of twilight state of consciousness. So if you remember correctly, it is upon the irresponsibility for the person for the actions they have committed in this state, because they do not have any control over their actions. Also, there may be a short circuit response when there is a protected situation which traumatizes the psyche, and at a certain point the discharge of all these emotions happens and the person commits a crime. Okay. And also pathological intoxication. So you know that some people become intoxicated by alcohol, but in some of them this may produce a change of consciousness, and usually this change with the estrangement from the surroundings happens on a very low doses of consciousness of the alcohol. And this is the difference. And in this state, the person is uncontrollable. They may commit crimes, they may try to run and be completely inadequate in their reactions. What else? What else? What else? Okay. All the disturbances of consciousness have common traits like estrangement from the outside world, the distortion of the thinking process, so the person doesn't think, automatic behavior, almost instinct-like behavior. So here is that. Okay, so we have finished with the consciousness. Usually it is enough for you just to see the person, to understand what is going on with their consciousness, to interact with them for a short period of time. And now let's talk about psychopathological syndrome. So before we were talking about mainly symptoms, and now we start to gather the symptoms into groups called syndromes. And this is very important because just like our psyche is integral, their phase of an illness is also integral. So you cannot have only one symptom of an illness and say, yes, I have this illness. No, since our psyche is omnipresent in our behavior and in our life, the psychopathological syndromes and illnesses also protrude through every sphere of our behavior. Okay, so all the syndromes can be divided into non-psychotic, borderline or neurotic syndromes, then psychotic syndromes, and de facto organic syndromes, accordingly to the registry of psychiatric illnesses. I'll just list them for now, and then I'll go into details for each of those. Non-psychotic syndromes include asthenic syndrome, which can be divided into astheno-neurotic, astheno-depressive, astheno-hypochondriac, and astheno-abulic. Also, apatho-abulic, neurotic and neurosis-like, and this includes neurasthenic syndrome, syndrome of obsessive states, dimorphophobic, and depressive hypochondriacal, and also psychopathic and also psychopathy-like. Now, psychotic syndromes. Psychotic syndromes include syndromes of cloudiness of consciousness, which we have discussed previously. Also, depressive syndrome, which is psychotic variant. The syndrome of hallucinosis, verbal, tactile, or visual hallucinosis. The syndrome of derealization and depersonalization. Maniacal syndrome. Paranoid, including hallucinatory paranoid, hypochondriac paranoid, dysmorphomanic. You remember dysmorphophobic was neurotic, but dysmorphomanic is already a psychotic syndrome. Kandinsky-Kirambo syndrome, or psychoautomatism, paranoid, and which I have talked about before, paraphrenic, hebephrenic, catatonic. Okay, and de facto organic syndromes include psychogenic, with its variants according to the mood of the patient, explosive, apathetic, or euphoric, post-amnestic, mental retardation syndrome, dementia, local and lacunar, and that's mostly all. So I want to start with the factor organic disorders because it is faster to talk about those. So the factor organic syndromes, psychogenic syndrome. Psychogenic syndrome is recognized by the mild diminishment of intellectual ability, usually to some organic disorder, for example, caused by the ingestion of drugs for a very long time, or alcoholism, such stuff. And here we can see that the person may have troubles with thinking, but not to the point of dementia. And based on the behavior, on the mood of the patient, we can say that they are euphoric, and this is euphoric variant of psychogenic syndrome, or they are apathetic or explosive. When we are talking about Korsakoff's amnesia syndrome, it has a variety of symptoms. There is fixative amnesia, anteroretrograde amnesia, and also cryptomnesia, confabulations, and pseudoreminiscences. So that patient who was a boxer, he has Korsakoff's amnesia syndrome because he has all the symptoms. And of course, this patient, this person with Korsakoff's amnestic may have a diminishment in the intellect. Now, mental retardation is solely the diminishment of intellect without amnesias. Innate if you are talking about oligophrenias, or acquired if you are talking about dementia. I'm already too tired. I messed things up. So mental retardation is a synonym to oligophrenia, but dementia stands a little bit further from that. So let's remember. So mental retardation is oligophrenia. When we're talking about dementia syndrome, it can be total or lacunar. When we're talking about lacunar, the person may lose their practical skills and some of their memory, but their core features of their personality are not changed, are not distorted. And when we're talking about dementia, which is total, the person may seem as another person to other people. If you want to get an experience of dementia, well, to some point, there is a musical album called In the End of Times, which simulates the progression of Alzheimer's disease. And you should listen from the first song to the last one, and then you'll get it. Okay, so here is that. Now, about psychopathological syndromes, which are psychotic ones. I have already talked about syndromes of cognitive subconscious, so I won't be stopping on those. And now let's talk about, let's talk about neurotic disorders. Yes, I want to talk about neurotic ones at first. Okay, so when we are talking about asthenic syndrome, the main symptom here is the weakening of their physical body, the exhaustion of their attention. The person may become unstable in their emotions and not feel rested and be insomniac in some cases. So that's asthenic syndrome. They may be capricious, tearful. Asthenic syndrome is present in all somatic disorders to a certain extent. When we're talking about asthenohypochondriac syndrome, we have all the symptoms and plus to that also hypochondriac ideas. But this is a neurotic syndrome. So this means that these people can be calmed down by the good analysis and by the objective measurement of their body when they have an idea that they have syphilis, for example, but they get the analysis that they do not have syphilis, and they're like, phew, thank God, I do not have syphilis, because they are neurotic. If they were psychotic, they wouldn't hear our counter arguments. So here's that. In anabolic, we have all the symptoms plus abulia. In apathoabolic syndrome, we have both the lack of the will to do something, the lack of inclination, and the lack of mood to do something. Okay. When we're talking about neurotic syndrome, it includes emotional instability and also certain level of irritability, when we are talking about neurasthenia, for example. Neurasthenia includes two parts, asthenia and neuron irritability. And it can be characterized by two types. It can be hypersensitive or the asthenic type. So one of these parts may be accentuated. It may start as hyperreactive state, but later on progress into asthenic type. Okay. Now about hysterical syndrome. Hysterical syndrome is characterized by the increased emotional excitability and ability, and also these people have a very high talent to repress memories, repress different functions of our body, because this mechanism of defense is hyperactive in these people. So here is that. People with hysterical syndrome may be also very theatrical in their emotions and their behavior. They attract a lot of attention to them. They have a lot of pathos in their behavior, in their movements, and in their speech. So here is that. We'll be talking about those disorders on the sixth topic, probably, if I remember correctly. Okay, so now about the syndrome of obsession. This syndrome is characterized by the person having phobias, obsessive thoughts, and sometimes compulsions. So obsessive compulsive syndrome is about that. Okay, phobic syndrome is characterized by the person having an idea that there is a certain bad thing about their appearance, and they want to hide it, and they're scared that they have it. If it progresses into the psychotic variant, psychotic variant is more for manic syndrome, the person also starts actively doing something in order to change this defect they have. And sometimes they may come to the plastic surgeon, and if plastic surgeon denies them the operation, they will perform the operation also, going against the self-preservation instinct, which is a sign of pathology. Okay, so now about depressive hypochondriacal syndrome. Depressive hypochondriacal syndrome is characterized by the appearance of depressive mood and also the fixation on the behavior, on the organism. So the person has the idea that they are ill. Okay, psychopathic and psychopathy-like syndromes. The difference is that, okay, at the core of syndromes are the emotional instability, the impulsivity, and the lack of planning. And when we are talking about psychopathic syndrome, it means that this person was like this for their whole life. When we are talking about psychopathy-like, we say that the person acquired traits of psychopaths throughout a certain disorder, for example, or maybe trauma or something like this. Okay, we have talked about delirium and such stuff. Okay, have I talked about dementia? Okay, dementia is a changed state of consciousness, which is more common among people in a very bad somatic state. And usually in this state, their thinking becomes fragmented, and it is a very dangerous state because the changes in the physiological functions of our body are so drastic that the person can be at risk of death. So here is that. Okay, we have talked about this, we have talked about that. Now, about depressive syndrome. So, I have already told you that it is not enough to have one symptom out of the all and to consider yourself ill with certain illness. This is true for depression and for mania. When we are talking about depressive syndrome, the person not only has down a mood, but they also have loss of interest and pleasure. They also have a certain view of themselves, so they feel guilty, they feel self-humiliating. Their movements become slower, their thinking becomes slower, their speech is quiet. Their concentration is very low and very poor. Apart from being stuck on negative emotions and negative memories at which these people excel. And also there will be vegetative changes in the body. So the person may experience constipations, tachycardia, and also mydriasis. Okay, sometimes the person doesn't feel low in cases when they are very good at representing emotions. But once again, like I talked previously, emotions are tension, emotions are energy, and this energy needs to be released. If it is not released, it is stored in the body, and it influences the psychophysiological functions of our body. So sometimes depression can be masked. It can have masks of anxious disorders, because fear is another phase of sadness. It can be in the form of hypochondria or neurasthenic disorders. It can be in the form of disorder of biological rhythm, so insomnia or hypersomnia, and people with depression usually sleep a lot. But we will be talking about those because there is unipolar depression and there is bipolar depression. Also, there may be autonomic somatic endocrine disorders, so different like cardioneurosis, skin itching, anorexia, neurodermatitis, allergies, impotency, disorders of the menstrual cycle. There may be masks in the form of algae, like cephalgia, cardialgia, abdominalgia, and all the algias you can think of. Also, there may be pathopharmacological disorders, for example, disturbances of drives, dipsomania, narcomania, toxicomania, and I'll be talking about those in the future as well. I love drug addicts. That's like one of my most favorite category of patients. They love me very much. Usually they have depression at the core of their problems, and they just try to cope with these emotions via these disturbance of drives. Social behavior as well, disputability, impulsiveness, fits of aggression, hysterical responses. When we're talking about the maniacal syndrome, once again, there is also the same vegetative symptoms I have listed for the depression, but the mood is the opposite. It is elevated, the sense of self is grand, impaired, the judgment is impaired, the person is impulsive, they spend money a lot, their speech is very fast, they don't need sleep almost at all, they may become aggressive, and they are euphoric. I'll be talking about those symptoms as well in the future. Okay, and what else? What is here? What is that? Why is this here? Horrible. I have seen a slide I don't need to see in my presentation. Okay, so that's all for today. I have survived. I hope you too. Unfortunately, there won't be another video today because I'm just too tired, but I guess students won't be too sad that they don't have that much homework for today. So the next time we'll have the third topic. See you soon during it. Bye.